From Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, California, Libros, Schmibros Lending Library presents the Latinidad Beyond Borders podcast. Latinidad encompasses the diverse experiences of people who live in Latin America, as well as people of Latin American descent who live in the United States. This podcast explores culture, society, and politics across the Americas through the lens of Latinidad. Hi, welcome to Latinidad Beyond Borders. I'm your host, Alberto Sahagún. My guest today is Héctor Lindo-Fuentes, who is an Emeritus Professor at Fordham University in the Department of History. He specializes in the history of Central America and El Salvador. And he's written many books in English and in Spanish. And you can listen to him on his YouTube channel. That's at Héctor Lindo. It is in Spanish, but that's very informative. So I suggest if you want to get into more depth in the issues we talk about, that you check out his YouTube channel. So welcome, Héctor.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for being here. So El Salvador has gotten quite a bit of attention in the US recently. And its president, Nayib Bukele, who was elected in 2019, has attracted international attention for his policies in combating gang violence. He has his critics and supporters inside and outside of El Salvador. He's combated gang violence through a program of mass incarceration without due process. And President Donald Trump is an admirer of his policies. Trump invited Bukele to the White House in April, welcomed him, and they seem to be working closely together in Trump's plans for mass deportations, where he's sending alleged gang members to prisons in El Salvador without due process. Not only Salvadorians, but Venezuelans. And it's become clear that some of those who were deported are not gang members. The wrongful deportation of Abrego Garcia has gained a lot of attention in the US. And we're going to get to current events later in the podcast, but I want to have you understand what's going on today by going back and looking at the history of El Salvador in the 20th century and place current events in their proper historical context. So, Professor Lindo, if we can talk about US-Salvadoran relations starting in the early 20th century. And that was a period when the US was engaging in an aggressive imperialist project. This is when the Panama Canal was built. So talk about how the people of El Salvador and its government responded to these aggressive US actions in the early 20th century.
Well, you mentioned the Panama Canal, and I think it's a good place to start because the interest of the United States in Central America in general has to do with its geographic position. There's geopolitics involved. And actually, it's since the middle of the 19th century that you start seeing an increased interest of the US in Central America. In the middle of 19th century, at the time of the gold rush, there were many people trying to use the narrowness of Central America to get quickly to the gold fields in California. And that was a time when William Walker filibuster took over Nicaragua. So that's just to show how that area in particular was interesting to the United States very early on. after the Spanish-American War and the construction of the Panama Canal, Central America became more interesting because the Panama Canal was considered to be the most important geopolitical asset for the United States. It had been an enormous investment in money. It was strategically extremely important because all the Navy passages would go from the Navy, when it wanted to go from the Pacific to the Atlantic and vice versa, would use the Panama Canal. So it was tremendously important. So the United States decided that they could not allow any European influence in the area. At that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, the threat was not the Soviet Union, but was Europe. There was a competition between empires. So uh, the United States decided that it was not good for the United States to have an instability, political instability in the countries of Central America, because that would invite foreign intervention, particularly from European powers. And that meant that there was a very close supervision. And it was a time of the so-called gunboat diplomacy. Theodore Roosevelt used the phrase, speak softly but carry a big stick. So it was, you try to persuade people to behave, but when they didn't behave, he would send the Navy to any Central American country that misbehaved. And in fact, Nicaragua was invaded for a while. So was Panama. The Panama Canal had a canal zone that was completely controlled by the US. And in most histories, El Salvador is not put in the category of countries that were direct victims of gunboat diplomacy. But that's inaccurate. There were constant visits of the Pacific Fleet to Salvadoran ports at times when there was political instability to remind people who was the boss. And there was always influence in El Salvador. And people in El Salvador resented that tremendously. And there was a very strong anti-imperialist movement at the beginning of the 20th century. From 1912 on, from the time when the United States invaded Nicaragua up until the 20s, there were mass demonstrations against US influence. But the US gained influence through other avenues other than military, by extending loans to El Salvador and making the country commit the resources that came through customs to guarantee those loans. So in effect, there was a great deal of influence from the United States to El Salvador up until the 1930s. And then the situation changed. When World War II began, President Roosevelt, the second President Roosevelt, FDR, had a new policy called the Good Neighbor Policy, which meant that the United States would not intervene directly. There was a commitment of the United States to stop that gunboat diplomacy. But what that did was to make it easy for dictators to do whatever they pleased. And those dictators were in general very favorable to US policies. And that was helpful during World War II. And that the United States needed cooperation from Central American dictators. And that was the situation more or less until the Cold War began in earnest after the end of World War II, and particularly after the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah, and talk about the Salvadoran politics at this time. There was a constitution, but the political system was dominated by a small ruling class. You have the military later take direct control. So talk about that transition in the first half of the 20th century.
That's correct. There were civilian presidents until 1931, until the end of 1931. But because of the Great Depression, there was a great deal of political instability, economic instability, and a military leader whose name was Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez took advantage of that to give a coup d'etat and take over and started a military government. And military governments would be in power until 1979. When he took power, there was an uprising in the western part of the country, a peasant uprising. People were desperate because of the lack of opportunities, the mistreatment from the landlords who were very abusive, and there was a fair amount of communist agitation. The response of Hernandez Martinez to that uprising in 1932 was brutal. Tens of thousands of people were killed in a matter of weeks in the name of anti-communism. And from that moment on, the idea of the communist threat was the justification to rule the country with an iron hand. The army used that as an excuse to control any kind of opposition. Anybody who opposed their power was labeled as communist, could be put in jail, could be repressed, could be even be murdered. And that way, different military governments were in power until 1979. The interesting thing here is that after Martinez's term ended in 1944, after a general strike, the army took over, but not any particular individual in the army. The army would decide who would be president. There would be elections. They would fulfill the term. They would, on the surface, respect the Constitution, but the army was in complete control of who would be the next president. That is, there were not free and fair elections as you know them, but there were elections nonetheless. There was the fiction that the Constitution was followed. So that was the reason why anti-communism was so powerful in the country, because it was the main justification for the army to keep control. And the army was, of course, in cahoots with big business, with the big landlords. The big landlords were happy to have the army controlling the population as long as they were allowed to make money and to pay low wages.
Yes. And during the Cold War, the US in Latin America supported any anti-communist government, even if they weren't pro-democracy. And that was the main focus of not preventing the expansion of communism. And that meant any kind of left-wing movement in Latin America was suspect. But you see that those US policies would, in El Salvador, right, contribute to this bloody civil war in the 1980s. So talk about the causes of that civil war.
That's correct. There are different causes for the civil war. Some, of course, are deeply rooted in history. The inequality that goes back to the 19th century, the growth of the coffee industry at the end of the 19th century made it worse by allowing a coffee planter class, a relatively small group of people, to concentrate power, concentrate wealth, concentrate land in a few hands. And that was their power base. And that was the main economic engine of the country. So you had this very profound separation between classes. And there was an ethnic dimension to that as well. The majority of the people in the countryside had indigenous backgrounds. When the 1932 uprising took place, the government repressed particularly indigenous people, and the rebellion took place in the western part of the country where there were more indigenous people. So there is this profound economic inequality, and that coupled with traditions of authoritarianism. uh, repression to any kind of opposition, uh, breaking any kind of democratizing effort. And there were democratizing efforts in 1944, in 1960, in 1979, but no opposition rooted in democracy was allowed to succeed. So there was no other way but a violent solution, many people thought. So many people in the opposition were radicalized by this uncompromising position of the army and the oligarchy. Uh, there was a feeling that if you tried a democratic way to change things, that wouldn't work. So the violent option was becoming more and more useful. And at the same time, there was a Cold War sort of impulse coming to Central America in the form of US support, in form of the training of the armies, training of intelligence officers, and there was also a movement in Nicaragua that brought the end of the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza in 1979. So these were precipitating factors so that in 1980 the conditions were ripe for an uprising. And any kind of opposition coming even from the Catholic Church, for example, the liberation theology movement, that was very important. That would bring hope to peasants, but when peasants wanted to better themselves, they would face a brick wall.
Yes. So the Civil War in the 80s was very damaging. Many people were killed, and many people tried to flee the country and came to the US. And you have a situation where you have Salvadorians coming to cities like Los Angeles. And some young people got involved in the gang culture in these cities. And then after the Civil War ends and you have the 90s come and there's a peace agreement in El Salvador, but then you have the deportation of gang members who were undocumented uh, from the US who were arrested and deported, sent to El Salvador, a country they didn't really know, and the gang culture will then be brought there to El Salvador. So my question is, why in this post-Civil War period did the gangs eventually become so powerful in El Salvador? What were the political and economic conditions that allowed for that to happen?
Yeah, you're very correct in saying that the MS-13 that Donald Trump talks so much about is a US product, is a US export to El Salvador. And they come to El Salvador, they are deported, starting with the Clinton administration, there were mass deportations of undocumented Salvadorans who had committed crimes in the US. And they were mainly gang members. And they come to a country that is recovering from a civil war, that has serious economic problems, has very little social infrastructure to welcome them, to help them to adapt to the new circumstances. No, they come to a country with a great deal of unemployment. They come to a country where there are a lot of young people who are alone because the heavy migration during the Civil War have left many families disorganized. Parents living in the US, sending money to the grandparents, the kids are unruly, and they were very easy to recruit for the gangs. And the gangs had already had the technology of how to extract uh, funds from other people, extortion, and they knew how to engage in criminal activities. And the government also didn't know, the different governments didn't quite know how to deal with them. They tried different things. They tried repression. They tried to put a lot of them in jail. And what that did was to help them unify and help them to be in the same place, talk to each other, and create leadership. And also, they were used for electoral purposes. All the political parties in El Salvador have at one point or another uh, made pacts with the gangs, knowing that they controlled big population centers to get their votes and to get them to recruit people to vote for the specific party. And that's a part of the story. That's very sad to know that the leadership itself contributed to strengthen them.
Yeah, so that leads in 2019 to the election of Nayib Bukele, who was only 37 years old. And uh, talk about his presidency and what changed with his election and how his tactics were similar or different to previous presidents.
Well, the first thing to understand is when he comes to power, when he's elected when there is a vacuum of legitimacy in the political system. The two old political parties had not been able to deal with the gang problem. The gang problem had become very, very serious, affected people's daily life. Uh, People were afraid all the time. And the traditional parties couldn't handle it. They were also exposed for corruption, and they didn't have much to show in terms of accomplishments, although there were some accomplishments. One of them was the free press, that the press was allowed uh, to work freely and had access to information. And what that did was to give them the opportunity to show the corruption of the governments, and that led to disappointment from the part of the general population with the political system. So Bukele comes into that vacuum and he's elected. Now, a couple of weeks ago, there were these extraordinary interviews published by one of these journalistic outlets called El Faro, with interviews of two gang members, two leaders of the gangs in El Salvador, that revealed that Nayib Bukele, in order to get elected, first as mayor of San Salvador and later on as president of El Salvador, had pacts with the gangs, had bribed the gangs so that they would get votes for him. When he was elected with very narrow margins. So he basically owes his presidency to pacts with the gangs, according to these interviews, which have been kind of an atomic bomb in Salvadoran politics. I mean, people are mesmerized by these interviews because they're very compelling and tell a story very different from what the government is telling you. So there is this element of his coming to power because he knew how to manipulate the gangs. He also has extraordinary ambition, and the more we know about how he came to power, you see that he had a plan very early on to accumulate as much power as possible. And he has a tremendous ability with propaganda. His ability to craft an image, to create his image as a young guy who is going to provide security to the people, and is not only within the country but also internationally. He's been brilliant at that. Has invest significant resources in social media, for example, and many people working for him, crafting messages, producing videos, and creating this extraordinary image of a young leader who has brought safety to the country. Now, in order to bring safety to the country, he has destroyed the institutions of democracy, the independence of the judicial system, the independence of the legislature have been obliterated by him. When he won a majority in the legislature in 2021, he moved very quickly to replace the part of the Supreme Court that deals with constitutional issues, and that was to guarantee his reelection. And he fired all the senior judges, which also instilled fear in all the young judges. So the message was clear. Either you do as I say or you're fired and you lose your careers. And every initiative is going to come from the presidency. So he accumulated power very, very quickly after after he won majority in the legislature. And even before that, you could see that that's where he was going to. And this is before getting control of the gangs. He uh, he would do things like for Independence Day, an enormous military parade glorifying him, sort of glorifying the president, not the institutions, not celebrating a glorious past, but celebrating him as the leader of the country. He goes to the UN and he takes a selfie in front of everybody so that he appears in all the newspapers in the world as this young millennial president. So everything is about image, which is tremendously important to him, but also about accumulating power. And then in March of 2027, the pact that he had with the gangs uh, broke down. We don't know exactly why. And there were a series of horrible murders in the country. And he took advantage of that to decree a state of exception, which is a suspension of constitutional rights, a suspension of due process, for example, which allowed him to put in prison thousands of people. Up to 70,000 people ended up in prison, and many of them innocent. There are some calculations that up until 10% of the people who were put in prison at that particular time were innocent. But without due process, there's no easy way for people to say, I'm innocent, let me prove it. There's no space for them to prove that they were not guilty of anything. So the human rights situation has become very, very serious, and many people have died in prison. Just today, there is a story of two people who died in prison.
Yes. And uh, so a final question, how do you see US and Salvadoran relations today, and in light of that longer history? Bukele has cultivated a relationship with the American right very deliberately. He goes to CPAC and he has contacts. And of course, Trump and Bukele seem to be on friendly terms, have a mutual admiration. So, and Trump has talked about sending US citizens to Salvadorian prisons. So, how do you interpret what he's doing?
Well, the first thing to know is that this is not about ideology. When he was elected mayor two times, he was elected mayor as member of the left-wing party. His first steps as a politician were as a member of the left-wing party, and he had an advertising agency that ran the campaign for left-wing parties. When he comes to power, he found that it was more useful for him to appear as right-wing, and he did so. So there's no ideology here. With Trump, he's perceived and he was advised that it would be a good partner because neither of them believe in checks and balances and in the independence of the judiciary and in due process. So it's a good match in terms of authoritarian inclinations. And he had hired a lobbyist in Florida that opens the door for him in right-wing circles. He pays a lot of money to this guy. And for Bukele, the main interest is to make sure that the gang leaders that are in prison in the US and are about to be tried are not tried in the US but are returned to Bukele, because it is a different thing to have an opposition uh, newspaper or news outlet to publish an interview with a gang leader than to have another gang leader saying the same things under oath in an American court. So the main preoccupation for Bukele is to make sure that among the people who are sent to the Salvadoran prisons, there are leaders of the gangs who are currently in custody in the United States, who are about to be tried and who are about to say things that are going to be very, very uncomfortable. And of course, for the Trump administration, the attractiveness of dealing with Bukele is to deal with someone who doesn't care about due process, who's going to do anything that they want, and is going to help them to create this image of mistreatment of migrants. And treating migrants poorly is apparently something that they find politically useful.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming on. That was very informative. And the audience, check out his YouTube channel at Lindo-Fuentes, Héctor Lindo. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye.